Okay, let's jump in. Whirlwind tour of Matthew. Here's the plan for tonight. We'll briefly review over the next 5 minutes what we've talked about so far with the big picture of Matthew as well as what's happened so far in the first 4 chapters. We're going to read the entire Sermon on the Mount tonight. I don't know if that's a good plan or a bad one, but it's the plan. So we'll spend about 15 minutes reading all of chapters 5, 6, and 7. I'll have a question at that point for you guys to talk about. So all of us are sitting near somebody to be able to turn and talk. So you'll do that for our discussion question after we read the sermon, and then we'll spend the last 15, 20 minutes of class going over the main points from chapter 5, and then we'll do the rest of the sermon, Lord willing, on Sunday. So let's talk about Matthew up to this point. Remember, this is one of the ways to understand what Matthew is doing as a writer, that he is alternating between sections of what we call narrative, that just means story, okay, and then sections of teaching, where Jesus is just talking basically straight by himself for a whole chapter or more. Now, obviously, in the narratives, there is talking, okay, and sometimes in the teaching, there will be a question asked or something that will happen. But basically, there's a back and forth here between action taking place and then a discourse or a section of Jesus' teaching. And what Matthew is doing is he is weaving all of this together so that each section of narrative, each section of stories, the events are leading up. Sometimes in the plot, but even just thematically, the events are leading up to the teaching, okay? And then the teaching is kind of catapults us into the next section of story, and the themes will be picked up in the events that take place following the teaching. Hopefully we'll be seeing this as we go along, but let's start by pointing this out as our lead up to chapter 5, 6, and 7, okay? Here's what we've seen in the first 4 chapters. 2 main themes. There are others, of course, but 2 themes that Michael and I have tried to emphasize so far. The first is that the first 4 chapters of Matthew show Jesus as the king, okay? And here are a few references to that, and there's more that we could include, okay? The genealogy emphasizes the son of David. I'll have to interrupt class just to get, you want purple? Yeah, I at least knew what color folder she wanted. The genealogy in chapter 1 emphasizes, you guys need folders over there? Hollins? By the way, if you're getting a folder tonight, you have actually more than what other people have. So when we do reloads on Sunday and people get more handouts to add to more lessons, if you got one tonight, you're good. Don't take more on Sunday. You'll be all set. So, King of the Jews, remember that's the story of the Magi, however many of them there were. They come to Herod to see the King of the Jews. And the fact that he is called a king is why they come to worship him and bring gifts, also why Herod is upset about this baby that's been born. Remember the reference to the Nazarene at the end of chapter 2? We've made the suggestion is the word Nazar, meaning branch, the prophecy of the Messianic king from books like Isaiah and Zechariah. And then twice in chapters 3 and 4, John and then Jesus announced that the kingdom is at hand, okay? So that's one theme, Jesus as the king. And that theme ties him to David, the major Old Testament figure, King David, okay? The other theme that we've emphasized we might think of in connection with Moses, the great deliverer of the Old Testament. But more broadly than that, we can see Jesus as the continuation and the fulfillment. That's the phrase that we've used. The continuation and the fulfillment of Israel's story. And this way of describing the events shows us pretty clearly that Matthew is painting a picture of a new Israel, okay? Saved as a baby from the king trying to kill the babies, coming up out of Egypt, passing through the water of baptism in Matthew chapter 3, led by the Spirit into the wilderness, okay? Think back to the story of the wilderness in Exodus and the cloud that led the people through the wilderness. Matthew says the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness. He's tempted, Michael pointed this out very well on Sunday, tempted in a way to mimic the ways that Israel failed. Jesus succeeds. He then has a following, again, think Moses, of the masses, and he leads them up onto a mountain in chapter 5 to proclaim a new law. Think of Jesus as a new David. Think of Jesus as a new Moses. And in that context, then think of two purposes for the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5, 6, and 7. Okay? On one hand, the Sermon on the Mount is a manifesto, we might call it, a manifesto of the kingdom. Okay? What we mean by that is this is what the kingdom is all about. These are the core tenets, we might say, of the kingdom of the Messiah. Okay? And so as we read through the sermon, think about this. What is Jesus saying about the kingdom? Okay? What is this kingdom like? What's the nature of the kingdom according to the sermon? And those that are in the kingdom citizens, we might say, what is their character? What is the character of the citizens of this new kingdom? So think about the sermon in that way, but also think about the sermon, again, playing off of the connection to Moses as a new law. Ask yourself as we read, what is new about this law that Jesus is proclaiming? If we think about it that way. And what is its relationship to that previous law, the law of Moses? And what does Jesus say about that? Okay. Sermon on the Mount as a manifesto of the kingdom that Jesus is introducing and saying is at hand, and the Sermon on the Mount as a new law proclaimed from a new mountain, so to speak. Let's just read this thing. And as I said, this will take about 15 minutes. And since this is the topic of our study for the next 2 class periods, not a huge length of time to cover everything, but we at least want to get the entire thing in front of us. I don't know whether you've read the entire Sermon on the Mount in one go before, but if you haven't, then in about 15 minutes, you can say that you have. So let's read. We're going to just read the words of Jesus. So that's starting in Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, and reading through just about the end of chapter 7. Here we go. Look at the text in front of you as we read. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything, except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Verse 17. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law, while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown in prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off, throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It was said, 'Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again you have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord.' But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be, 'Yes, yes,' or 'No, no.' Anything beyond these is of evil. You have heard that it was said, 'An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth.' But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore you are to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Chapter 6. Beware of practicing your righteousness before men, to be noticed by them. Otherwise you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. So when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving will be in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. When you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But you, when you pray, go into your inner room, close your door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you are praying, do not use meaningless repetition, as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words. So do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Pray then in this way: Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For if you forgive others for their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions. Whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance so that they will be noticed by men when they are fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that your fasting will not be noticed by men, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Chapter 6, verse 19. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life, as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? And who of you, by being worried, can add a single hour to his life? And why are you worried about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow, that they do not toil, nor do they spin. Yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Do not worry then, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what will we wear for clothing? For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So do not worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Matthew chapter 7. Do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to dogs. Do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. Or what man is there among you who, when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. Chapter 7, verse 13. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. But the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles, are they? So every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then, you will know them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house. And yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Okay, there you go. There's a Sermon on the Mount. Take a chance to talk with each other. Find someone near you, group of 2 or 3, or those that you're sitting with. Here's a question I want you to discuss. What is the most shocking thing, the most surprising thing about Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount? Could be a general observation that kind of runs throughout, or maybe it's a very specific verse or specific statement that Jesus makes. But what is the most surprising thing to you, the most shocking thing about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount? Discuss that here for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll jump into chapter 5. Okay, I'd love to hear what everybody thought was the most shocking thing, but for the sake of time, hopefully that was helpful just to talk this over with the people next to you. And we're going to go ahead and, for the sake of time, to try to get through chapter 5. Maybe there will be opportunities as we go to shout out some thoughts from your discussion as they are relevant to the text that we're talking about, either tonight or on Sunday, okay? But the reason I ask this question is because I think the sermon is, or at least should be, shocking. That radical is, perhaps a word you could use. I recommend this book highly. We're not drilling down into the Sermon on the Mount, so by the time you order it and get it, we'll be like long past it in Matthew. But this is called Invitation to a Spiritual Revolution by Paul Earnhardt. It's actually just a collection of articles that he wrote for Christianity Magazine, and then they were compiled into a book. The nice thing about that is that each one's like a couple pages, so they're really easy to read, just kind of one after the other, or one a night or something. Very, very good. And I think most of that is because the ideas of the Sermon on the Mount are so profound that Jesus lays out, but Brother Earnhardt does a masterful job, as always, articulating some of the more profound things. But even in the title of that book, A Spiritual Revolution, okay? I think the Sermon on the Mount is that. It is radical. It is shocking. Would have been. Some people over here were talking about there's the shock factor for the people that first heard it, as well as the shock factor for even for us reading it in the 21st century. Okay, shocking to both, maybe in different ways, but I think shocking to both. So let's talk about chapter 5 and see how much of this we can get through. We begin with the Beatitudes, famously, followed by the similitudes, which just means, you are the salt. It's the similes of the sermon, right? You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. One of the articles that Paul Earnhardt has on the Beatitudes is called A Gospel for Losers. And I think that's a pretty good description. You read the Beatitudes, what kind of people are in the kingdom? What kind of people find blessedness? Okay? It's not the strong, the mighty. Remember 1 Corinthians trio, right? The strong, the noble, and I'm forgetting it. It was my own memory work we did billions of times in 1 Corinthians, right? Wise, mighty, and rich. Okay, remember, that's not the Beatitudes, okay? Instead, this idea of blessedness, and hopefully we know that blessedness, blessed are, this is more than just a circumstantial happiness. This is more than just a feeling of, oh, things are going so well. Now, this is a contentment and a joy and a fulfillment that runs deeper than any external circumstance could ever change, okay? And who is that blessedness for? Well, it's for those who are broken, those who are poor, mourning, meek, hungry, persecuted. Jesus starts by saying that those who will find blessedness are those who recognize, some have said about the very first one, maybe is the key of all of them, poor in spirit. Those who recognize their own spiritual bankruptcy, okay, their spiritual impoverishment. They are nothing on their own, but broken and destitute, okay? But in that brokenness and destitution, they are yearning for God, okay? The mourning, has to be mourning for the brokenness of sin, both my own sin as well as the sin of a fallen humanity, okay? Hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Righteousness, I think we'll talk about this as we go. Righteousness being the reconciliation between God and man, a right state of being man with God, man with man. Okay? Hungering and thirsting for that righteousness, that reconciliation with God, because of a profound awareness and a pain that things are not right as they stand because of my sin. Those that are pure in heart, they want to see God and they will see God. And then hopefully we notice that, especially towards the end of these, this yearning for God, this yearning for righteousness that comes from a profound sense of spiritual bankruptcy, then manifests itself in longing for this reconciliation with others. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the merciful. Okay, I recognize my state before God, what I need from Him, and I show that to others as well. Okay, but it is truly a gospel for the losers, so to speak. Brokenness runs throughout the Beatitudes. But those who come to God with that attitude then receive this blessedness, and they become those who God uses to do His work in the world, right? Salt and light. That means a real difference that's made in the world, okay? For salt, we're talking about preservation most likely. This is not just like, the disciples of Jesus make other people's scrambled eggs taste okay, No, salt was used for preservation of meat in particular, okay? A necessity for well-being and for life, okay? I think I spelled that right? I think I did spell that right. Preservation, right? And light, obviously for guiding, light in the darkness, but notice specifically the light, the city set on a hill that God's people are, the shining of that light is really to attract people to God, to point to him and to glorify him. Okay? But here's what I want to say. When we say different people make a difference, we say this is the calling of God's people, right? In some ways we would say it's the byproduct, right, of God's people being who they're supposed to be, right? You can try really hard, I guess, to be salt and light. But if you're not the kind of person that the Beatitudes have just described, then you never will be salt and you never will be light, right? The similitudes, the salt of the earth, the light of the world, that's the effect, the natural effect that the kingdom citizens have when they are the people described by the Beatitudes. So there's an order you have to kind of get right here. Also, I was going to point out that this has been the calling of God's people forever. Think about the promise to Abraham, right? Your descendants will be a blessing to the world. Think about the language of Israel. You're a light to the nations, okay? This is who God's people have always supposed to be, and kingdom citizens are called to this, okay? Real quick, any comments or questions about anything through verse 16? The shortest covering of the Beatitudes in your life, probably. But any quick comments or questions about it? Cool. Moving on then. Notice verse 17 to 20. This is, I think, a key section of the sermon because I think it clears up a lot of what's coming next. Okay. Notice the big statement in verse 17. Jesus seems to be making this as a main point, right? Jesus' goal in coming was not to abolish, to do away with, in the sense of kind of, it means nothing, right? The law and the prophets, right? He did not come to abolish those things, but to fulfill it. So the question would be, in what sense does Jesus fulfill the law and the prophets? Probably several that we could talk about. In one sense, he came to fulfill the law and the prophets by keeping the commandments of the law perfectly. Okay, so that's one sense, right? No one had ever done that before. Jesus came to do that, or in coming, he did do that. Keeps the law perfectly. But I think that more to the point of what he's going to say in the sermon, Jesus and Jesus' kingdom, Jesus' teaching, fulfill or restores the righteousness originally intended by the law. Okay? And again, in thinking righteousness, thinking the reconciliation of God and man, the reconciliation of man with man. Okay? Jesus is restoring this righteousness that the law originally intended. We'll talk about what we mean by that as we go. Okay? And finally, he accomplishes what the law never could accomplish. Right? And we're familiar with this sort of thing from especially later on in the New Testament, where Paul and the Hebrew writer will talk about Jesus being able to offer forgiveness of sins, something that the law could never offer. And so in these ways, Jesus is fulfilling the law and the prophets. Okay. Now, because of all of this, notice the language in especially 17 to 19. Jesus has a very high view of the law. We need to get this, especially for the next section. Jesus does not come along and is dismissive of the law and be like, oh, that old thing, forget that, right? Means nothing. It was all whack anyway, God was kind of just doing it, trying it out, and it was clearly, the law was good for nothing, and so we're going to start over here, reset, right? Throw it all out. Jesus has a very high view of the law. In fact, we'll see he has a higher view of the law than anybody in his day, right? He says every jot and tittle, right, matters. Every little thing. You teach it and you do it, right? Jesus himself did that, and he commanded that sort of high view of the law, okay? And so then as we enter into this next section of the sermon, he's going to contrast two versions of righteousness. And we might think, oh, Jesus is contrasting like the old law and his new law. He's contrasting righteousness under the law of Moses and righteousness in the kingdom of heaven, right? And I'll suggest to you that's not at all what Jesus is doing, or at least it's not mainly what Jesus is doing. As verse 20 makes clear, Jesus is about to make a contrast, not between the law of Moses and the law of Christ per se, but he's making a contrast between what the Pharisees, the religious teachers of the day, have done with the law, and in teaching the law, and with the law as it's meant to be understood, or really we would say the law as it is now fulfilled in Christ. Okay. Are there changes from the law of Moses to the law of Christ? Absolutely. We're going to see some of that even here in chapter 5, particularly with the commandment about divorce. Okay. But I think we'll see there's much more continuity between the law of Moses and the law of Christ than maybe we're used to thinking about. And really what Jesus is highlighting is the misuse, the abuse of the law by the Pharisees. Okay. I almost ran out of time to make this really bold claim and then not have to defend it until Sunday. But we still have about 8 minutes left, so let's keep going here. Here's an example, right? Notice this passage in Leviticus 19. And Leviticus is a tough book, right? We stay away from it in our yearly Bible reading. We've probably already fallen off the wagon by Leviticus 19. If not, we're just totally brain dead and miss everything that we're reading, okay? But notice what is said here in a book like Leviticus, of all things. And notice that some of this sounds kind of like the Sermon on the Mount, actually. Leviticus 19, verse 11 to 18. You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, so as to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning. You shall not curse a deaf man, nor place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall revere your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people. And you are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. Notice verse 17. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor, but shall not incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Okay? So have a passage like this in mind as we go through what Jesus is going to say. Jesus is contrasting some things here. Okay? I gave you a chart like this in your lesson book. This is a little bit more built out, and so more categories here. Okay? But for each of these examples, Jesus is going to say, you have heard that it was said, or you have heard that the ancients were told. And he's going to quote usually a passage from the Old Testament. Okay? But then what he's going to do is show how that part of God's law, the law of Moses, has then been unfairly used, abused, misused by the Pharisees. The Pharisees have taken God's law and they have twisted it or used it for their own selfish gain. And Jesus is going to repudiate that and then talk about what the true intent of the law is and or what he says as now the Word of God incarnate. Okay, so let's just take this one at a time. We'll get through as many as we can get through. Anger is the first example, 21 to 26, right? What's the command? Exodus 20, verse 13. You shall not commit murder. It's one of the 10 commandments. Okay, we got that. What were the Pharisees doing with that? Well, we're obviously inferring from Jesus' teaching, but notice how Jesus is intent to say, right, simply not murdering isn't enough. It seems like the Pharisees had, used this. You've heard that it was said. They've gone on saying, you shall not murder, but anything up to that point is okay. So you want to insult, you want to hold a grudge, you want to have resentment in your heart, you want to have anger in your heart towards somebody, right? They would have said, well, that's fine. That's okay. You haven't crossed the line. You shall not murder, okay? Now, let me just to clarify my point, go back to Leviticus 19. Is that what God wanted in the law? In the law of Moses, was it God's design that people would hate each other, be angry with each other, be bitter with each other, insult each other, but they wouldn't murder each other? That's what the law of Moses says, right? No, we just read in Leviticus, of all places, do not hate your countrymen in your heart, okay? So the Pharisees they're not following what the law says. They've twisted this for their own personal gain, okay? You can imagine the consequence. In each of these consequences, we see the opposite of the righteousness of God. The righteousness of God brings together God and man, brings together man and man. You live in a world where people are insulting and bearing grudges and holding resentment. That is the crumbling of relationships. And so Jesus says instead, cleanse your heart, first of all. Get the anger out of your heart. Get the resentment out of your heart. And then do whatever you need to do to reconcile. Reconciliation for Jesus is the most important thing in any relationship. Don't let another day go by. Don't go give your offering to the Lord until you have made things right. Okay? Go to your brother and reconcile. That's the righteousness of the kingdom of God. It starts in the heart, getting rid of the anger, and it results in reconciliation of relationship between man and man, or man and woman, woman and woman. You get the idea. Okay? So you see how this is going to work. I think all of these follow a similar pattern. Lust. Do not commit adultery. That's the next of the 10 Commandments. It seems like the Pharisees had taken this and said, okay, well, as long as you're not committing the act of adultery, then, you can lust after a woman, desire another woman who's not your own. Again, is that what the law, what God really wanted even in the Old Testament? You could think of not in the law per se, law of Moses, but think about a passage like Job 31:1. I've made a covenant with my eyes that I will not look upon a virgin to lust after her. Okay, that's always what God wanted. Right? But the Pharisees have twisted this, and what's the result? What's the result of a world where maybe there's not adultery, but men are desiring each other's wives? Well, it's a pretty shallow, marriage of distrust and really betrayal from the heart. So what does Jesus say? Get into your heart and radically remove, whatever it takes, remove what needs to be removed in order to avoid the sin of lust. Okay. Now here's where there is a change from the law of Moses in divorce. Okay, but still a twisting, right? So we still have this theme of the Pharisees twisting. Moses, and I write this down. Go read it for yourself. Deuteronomy 24 is an interesting passage. It's just the first 4 verses of Deuteronomy 24. Gives this command or this regulation about what to do when a man divorces a woman. Okay, there's some question about what the allowance for divorce was, and the rabbis, as you can imagine, disputed this heavily. Okay, some said the woman burns the toast, then you can divorce her. Some said the passage meant it was kind of like Jesus said for fornication. But regardless, there was a process of giving a certificate of divorce. Well, the Pharisees had taken that and said, hey, look, Moses, remember this, we'll get to it later on in Matthew. Moses said, give her a certificate of divorce, so you can divorce for any reason, right? We'll get to Matthew 19. It's not at all what God intended from the beginning. But Jesus does here say, nope, here's the standard. The standard is no divorce, remarriage is adultery, unless that marriage has been ended for the one valid reason, which is adultery that's committed by one person in the marriage. Okay. By the way, that word unchastity, this idea of fornication, Greek word porneia, that's pretty clearly the act of sex with another person. Okay. This is not just any kind of sexual indecency. Indecency is a cause for divorce. This is the act of adultery. And Jesus says, if it's not that, then there's no other valid reason for divorce. Okay. And then these last 3, if we can get through them here. The oaths, okay? Leviticus 19, we saw that. Don't swear falsely. Don't break your vows to God. The Pharisees say, oh, well, if it's not a vow to God, then, I can vow on, oath on the gold of the temple or something. I don't understand how they did it. They had this complex calculus for some oaths were binding, some oaths were not binding. Jesus says, no, your word is your word. You say yes, you mean yes. You say no, you mean no. Okay. Did the second bell already ring? All right. It did ring? Okay. Well, he says the same thing about revenge, and he says the same thing about your enemies. And I think this is it here. Chapter 5, verse 48, I think, is all of this in a nutshell. So we'll start here with 5:48 and get into chapter 6 on Sunday. Thank you, guys. I would say read the whole sermon again between now and Sunday to prepare for class. If you need booklets, too, they're still somewhere. They're in the back if you need booklets with homework questions for next class.